Some moons after the geese had gone, crabs moved in to take their place as the principal source of food. And now Pentecoid discovered what the villagers meant when they claimed that Manitou, the Great Spirit, the Great Power, looked after them especially. It was a day in late spring when Navitan led him to her canoe, handing him a basket full of fish heads and bear gristle to tote along. The concoction smelled horrible and offensive, but Navitan assured him that this is what crabs preferred, and he wondered how the loose and almost rotting stuff could be attached to the curved hooks used in fishing. To his surprise, his wife had no hooks. "What kind of fishing is this?" he asked, and she smiled without offering an explanation. But once he had paddled her to the spot she had selected, she produced long strands of twisted fiber and deer gut, and to these she tied fish heads and chunks of gristly bear meat, throwing the lines in. Pentecoid looked for the telltale signs which indicated that a fish had bitten the lure, but there was no such movement, and he concluded that Navitan was not going to catch any crabs. But after a while, when there was no visible reason for her doing so, she began to pull in one of her lines with her left hand, holding in her right a long pole, to which was attached a loosely woven wicker basket. As the line slowly left the water, Pentecoid saw that the first fish head was about to appear. But what he did not see was that attached to it was a crab, cutting at the meat with his powerful claws and oblivious of the fact that he was being pulled almost out of the water. When the crab was visible to Navitan, she deftly swept her basket into the water and under the startled crab, lifting it as it tried to fall away, and plopping it, all legs wiggling and claws snapping, into the canoe. Pentecoid was stunned by the performance, and when his wife continued to haul in her line, catching crab after crab, he realized that here was a brand of fishing totally unlike any in which he had ever participated. "Why don't they swim away from the bait?" he asked. "Can't they see you're going to catch them?" "Oh, they like us to eat them," Navitan said. "Manitou sends them to us for that purpose." Pentecoid gingerly and carefully touched one and found the shell extremely hard, but he could not examine it closely, for the fierce claws snapped at him. And he was even more puzzled and perplexed when Navitan carried her 24 crabs to camp and pitched them into a pot of boiling water, for within moments they turned bright red. She then instructed him how to pick meat from the carcasses, and when she had a clay bowl filled, she told him to stop, for she knew that picking crab was a tedious and demanding job. 12 crabs produced only a handful of meat. But when she took this meat as her mother had taught her, and mixed it with herbs and vegetables and cornmeal, and formed it into small cakes, and then fried them in sizzling bear fat, she produced one of the finest dishes this river would ever know. "Cakes of crab," she called them, and Pentecoid found them subtle and delicious. "This is better," Navitan assured him, and when he doubted, she told him to wait until the crabs began to shed, and one day she brought him 4 that had newly cast their shells, and these she fried directly in hot bear grease, without first boiling or picking them. "Do I eat the legs and all?" Pentecoit asked, and she goaded him into trying them. And when he had finished the 4, he declared them succulent beyond belief, so absolutely and totally delicious. "Now you are one of us," Navitan said. While Pentecoit was initiating himself into such pleasant customs, he made a discovery which disturbed him. He found that what Skarchen had reported was true. This tribe never defended itself from enemies. And when the Susquehannocks intruded from the north or the Nanticokes from the south, no attempt was made to protect the village. The villagers seemed not to care what happened. They did not send any lookouts or spies. They mounted no sentries. They sent no patrols to check the frontiers, and engaged in no self-defense maneuvers. He was not surprised, therefore, when the children ran in one morning to report, "Here come the Nanticokes again!" No one panicked. Everyone placed essential goods in deerskin pouches, hid supplies of food in the forest nearby, and fled. The werewolf marched at the front of his people, as gallantly as if heading for battle, and took them deep into the fragmented, river-cut area northwest of their village. They had learned from frequent experience that the Nanticokes were reluctant to follow them into that chopped-up area. So they marched with a certain confidence that after some time, after a decent interval, during which the invaders would steal everything left behind and then retreat singing victory songs, they would return to their homes and resume life as it had been. Pentecoit was staggered. He couldn't believe this, was staggered by this attitude. When the children first reported the invasion, he had wanted to storm out to engage the enemy and fight, teach them a lesson, drive them back to the southern regions. But the old werewolves would have none of this, nor did any of his people wish to face the sturdier, stronger men from the south. "What do we lose doing it this way?" one of the women asked Pentecoit as they fled to the land of broken rivers. "We lose my wigwam," he said in some anger. "A wigwam we can build in a day. The dried fish, who cares? The salted duck they won't find. We stowed it among the oaks." When the tribe had hidden for 7 days, it was deemed likely that the Nanticokes had done their damage and retreated. But to confirm this and make sure, the scouts had to be sent back to ensure that they had really gone. No volunteers offered to do the spying, so Pentecoit, speaking for Skarchen, said, "We'll go." The interpreter, who had been captured once, wanted nothing to do with such an adventure, but Pentecoit insisted. And since going in the company of this brave Susquehannock would lend distinction to the little man, he reluctantly agreed. No spy in the long history of the region ever moved with more circumspection than Skarchen, as he entered the territory occupied by the invaders. Indeed, he was so painfully careful not to snap a twig that Pentecoit realized the little fellow's crafty plan. He would move so slowly that the Nanticokes would have 2 extra days to clear out. When he and Pentecoit did finally reach the village site, the enemy would be practically back in their own villages. But Pentecoit would have none of this and was determined to press forward, to see what kind of people the Nanticokes were. But he was simply unable to budge his fellow spy. No amount of scorn, no appeal to Skarchen's manhood worked. The little man refused to move forward ahead of the very careful schedule he had set himself. And in the end, he attached himself to a locust tree and could not be budged. So Pentaquad moved alone to the river. From a vantage point, from a high point, he observed the tag end of the Nanticokes, the tail end of the Nanticokes, as they rummaged one last time through the captured village, collecting final souvenirs and things of their raid. While the main body of people rambled east along the river, chanting a victory song, which told of how they had subdued the fiercely resisting village. 4 laggards remained behind, 4 men, wrestling with some captured article that was too big for them to handle. Pentaquad, watching them with amusement, could not resist making an arrogant gesture, even though he knew it was foolish and risky. Leaping from behind a tree, he uttered his wildest war cry, brandished his spear, and lunged at the 4 startled Nanticokes. These men were terrified by this apparition, 5 hands taller than they and much broader of shoulder, and they fled. But one of them kept his senses long enough to shout to those ahead, "The Susquehannocks!" And terror ensued. The entire foraging party fell into panic, abandoning whatever they had stolen, and with great clatter stormed and thrashed their way in undignified retreat. So definitive and loud were the sounds of defeat that even Skarchen was lured from his hiding place in time to see his friend Pentaquad brandishing his spear and chasing an entire Nanticoke army through the woods. It had never occurred to Skarchen that one resolute man might be the equal of 4 surprised Nanticokes, or 40 frightened ones. But when he saw the retreating feathers of the southern braves, he realized that he had witnessed a miracle, and he began fashioning the ballad and song that would immortalize the victory of Pentaquad and sing his praises. Fearless he strode among the robbers. Strong he faced the innumerable enemy. Thoughtless of danger, he engaged them, throwing the bodies up and over, smashing the heads and twisting the legs, till the exhausted foe screamed and trembled, asking mercy, kissing his hands in fear. It was an epic, a portrait in the most exalted woodland tradition, and as Pentaquad casually surveyed the trivial damage done his village and his wigwam, he listened with amusement to the chant that Skarchen was singing. It reminded him of the war songs he had heard as a boy, when the Susquehannocks returned from their forays against other tribes to the south. Those songs had depicted events of unbelievable heroism, and he had believed them. And now the bravest of the brave Susquehannocks, Chiroda and Mataloak and Wissahickon and Nantiquad, creep through the forest, spy out the fortress, and leap with violent bravery upon the foe. And now it dawned upon Pentaquad that the village his ancestors had attacked with such bravery was this village. and the enemies they had subdued were ones they had never faced, for the foe had been hiding in faraway marshes. There had been no battle, only in the minds of the ancient poets, who knew that when braves march forth into battle, it's obligatory that there be victory songs. And yet, even though he knew of the fakeness and fraudulence of such behavior, when the villagers timidly returned and saw to their delight that this time their goods had not been carried off, they began to chant Scarchin's composition and song, and to believe it. With appealing modesty, Pentaquad stood silent, allowing Scarchin to lead the applause. If the village had been saved, Pentaquad reasoned, it was because of his actions. And he would accept the credit. It was that night when the older men began thinking of him as a possible were-once.